Arizona Territory, 1878. The unforgiving summer sun beat down on the dusty plains outside Fort Apache, where the line between survival and death was as thin as a whisper. Xavier Vance pulled his hat lower, shielding his eyes from the glare as he surveyed the desolate landscape. At 25, he had already seen enough of the frontier's cruelty to believe one hard truth. Attachments only made a man vulnerable in a land that took more than it gave. "No use getting tied down out here," he muttered to his horse, a sturdy Palomino named Chief. "A man alone moves faster, stays safer." The words were a mantra he had repeated since watching his family's homestead burn 4 years prior, leaving him the sole survivor of a brutal raid. Xavier adjusted the rifle across his saddle and nudged Chief forward. His lean frame carried the strength of years spent breaking horses and driving cattle, while his clean-shaven face and sharp blue eyes belied his youth. Despite offers from several ranch owners to settle into a permanent position, Xavier preferred the freedom of short-term work that allowed him to move on before anyone got too familiar, before he got too attached. The U.S. Army had hired him as a scout and horse trainer at Fort Apache, a temporary arrangement that suited him fine. Fort Apache itself was a tension-filled outpost where cavalry soldiers kept uneasy watch over the recently established San Carlos Apache Reservation. The war between the Apache and the U.S. government had ended officially, but suspicion ran deep on both sides. 3 weeks into his contract, Xavier had done his job well enough, breaking the new cavalry horses and scouting the surrounding terrain. Another week and he'd collect his pay, then move on as always, somewhere new, somewhere no one knew his name. "Mr. Vance," the quartermaster's voice carried across the yard as Xavier dismounted. "Colonel wants to see you, says it's urgent." Xavier nodded, handed Chief's reins to a stable boy, and made his way to the commander's office, boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. Colonel Hendricks was a fair man by Army standards, but Xavier had learned to be wary of anything military officers deemed urgent. Inside the office, the colonel stood near the window, deep in conversation with a woman Xavier had never seen before. She turned as he entered and he found himself momentarily stunned. She was Apache, that much was clear, but she stood in the officers' quarters with uncommon dignity. Her dark hair fell in a thick braid over one shoulder, reaching almost to her waist. She wore a simple cotton dress of faded blue, clearly of white manufacture but adorned with traditional Apache beadwork at the collar. Her eyes, proud and direct, met his without hesitation. "Vance, good." "This is Zarina Valencia," the colonel said. 22 years old, half Apache, half Mexican. Her father was a trader who married into the Aravapa band before the Troubles. The colonel cleared his throat, referring obliquely to the Camp Grant massacre that had decimated that particular band of Apache 7 years earlier. "Miss Valencia has a proposition that might interest you, given your intended departure next week." Xavier shifted uncomfortably, sensing a complication to his carefully uncomplicated life. "Ma'am," he acknowledged with a nod, keeping his distance. Zarina's voice, when she spoke, carried the slight accent of someone who had learned English alongside Apache and Spanish. "Mr. Vance, I need passage to Tucson, and protection for myself and my children." "Children?" Xavier's brow furrowed. "2 small ones," she answered. "My sisters, she died in childbirth with the second a year ago. Their father was killed by soldiers before the baby was born." "Miss Valencia has been granted permission to leave the reservation," the colonel interjected, "as she is technically not full Apache and has relatives in Tucson willing to take her in. The Indian agent approved her papers yesterday." Xavier kept his face carefully neutral. "I'm not a transportation service, Colonel." "I can cook," Zarina said suddenly, her dark eyes intent on his face. "I can hunt. I can tend horses. I need a father for my children, not just for the journey but—" She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "For life. The journey is only the beginning." Xavier felt as though he'd been struck. "You're proposing marriage." "To a stranger." "I propose an arrangement," she corrected him. "My children need protection in the white man's world. I need a name that will allow us to live without harassment. You would gain a wife who can work beside you, cook your meals, tend your home." Xavier looked to the colonel in disbelief. "This is the urgent matter." Colonel Hendricks sighed. "Miss Valencia's situation is precarious. She's educated, was taught by missionaries before being returned to the reservation. She's capable, but an Apache woman with 2 children traveling alone. Will be preyed upon, Zarina finished matter-of-factly. I am not naive, Mr. Vance. I know what awaits me without protection. Xavier shook his head, backing toward the door. I'm sorry for your troubles, ma'am, but I'm not looking for a wife or children. Not now, not ever. The frontier's no place for family attachments. They just give fate something to take from you. Zarina's expression hardened slightly. You speak as one who has lost, so have I. But these children deserve a chance. Find someone else, Xavier said, turning to leave. I travel alone. The colonel's voice stopped him at the door. There's an additional $50 in it for you, Vance, Army funds. Get her safely to Tucson, that's all. What happens after is between you and her. Xavier paused, hand on the doorframe. $50 was a significant sum, nearly doubling his pay for the month. He could take her to Tucson, collect the money, and still walk away free. Just the escort, he clarified. No promises beyond that. Of course, the colonel agreed. Xavier glanced back at Zarina, whose face revealed nothing of her thoughts. I'll leave at dawn tomorrow, be ready with the children. We will be ready, she said simply. That night Xavier couldn't sleep. He paced his small quarters at the edge of the fort, cursing himself for agreeing to the job. Children complicated everything. They slowed travel, attracted attention, created noise. And this woman with her direct gaze and outlandish proposition had unsettled him in ways he couldn't define. Just to Tucson, he reminded himself, then she's no longer your concern. Dawn arrived with clear skies promising brutal heat by midday. Xavier had already loaded his pack horse and prepared chief when Zarina appeared at the fort gates. She carried a small bundle of possessions and held the hand of a solemn-faced boy about 4 years old. A baby girl no more than a year old was secured to her back with a woven cloth carrier. This is Tamaz, she said, nodding to the boy who regarded Xavier with suspicious eyes. And this is Luisa, she turned slightly to show the sleeping infant. Xavier nodded curtly, offering no smile to the boy. Getting attached to these children would serve no one. We need to make good time before the heat. Can he ride? He can ride with me, Zarina answered, her expression revealing a hint of disappointment at Xavier's coldness. They set out with the rising sun at their backs, Xavier leading the way southwest toward Tucson. The journey would take 5 days at a reasonable pace, perhaps 4 if they pushed hard. He intended to push hard. By midday, they stopped in the shade of a rocky outcropping. Xavier dismounted and handed Zarina a canteen without meeting her eyes. The boy, Tamaz, had been silent throughout the morning, occasionally pointing at distant birds or animals but never speaking. He does not talk much, Zarina explained, seeing Xavier's glance, not since the soldiers came. Xavier felt a pang of unwanted empathy. War does that, he said shortly, then busied himself checking the horses. You have known war too, she observed, not a question. Everyone out here has. Zarina unwrapped the baby from her back and settled against a rock to nurse her. You misunderstand my proposition, Mr. Vance. Xavier kept his back turned, giving her privacy. I understand fine, you need protection. I'm providing it to Tucson, end of story. I did not propose out of desperation alone, she said. I watched you 3 weeks at the fort. You are kind to your horse. You did not drink with the soldiers. You gave part of your rations to the children at the agency. You are a good man pretending not to be. Xavier turned, startled by her observation. You've been watching me. I observe everything, she said simply. It is how I survive. She adjusted the baby and continued, I do not ask for love, Mr. Vance, I ask for partnership. 2 alone are vulnerable. Together we could build something. Xavier frowned, you don't know me. I know enough, she countered. And you could know me if you would ask instead of hiding behind your wall of solitude. Her directness left him momentarily speechless. Before he could formulate a response, the baby began to fuss, and Tamaz pulled at his mother's skirt, pointing to something in the distance. Xavier followed the boy's gesture and tensed, dust on the horizon, moving fast, riders. We need to move, he said sharply, all personal conversation forgotten. Now. Zarina responded with immediate efficiency, securing the baby to her back again while Xavier quickly packed their meager supplies. Within minutes they were mounted and moving toward a more defensible position among the rocks. "Raiders?" Zarina asked quietly as they concealed themselves. Xavier nodded, rifle ready. "Apache renegades, looks like." "5, maybe 6, he glanced at her. "Your people." Her expression hardened. "Not all Apache are my people, just as not all white men are yours. These would be Chiricahua, most likely. They would kill me as readily as you." The riders drew closer, and Xavier could see they were indeed Apache warriors, probably from the band that had escaped the reservation months ago. They were heading directly across their path and would pass within 100 yards of their hiding place if they continued straight. Xavier felt sweat trickle down his spine as he watched through a gap in the rocks. Beside him, Zarina held Tamaz close, one hand firmly over the boy's mouth to prevent any sound. The baby, miraculously, had fallen asleep against her mother's back. The warriors slowed as they approached, and Xavier's grip tightened on his rifle. They'd seen something, tracks perhaps, or the disturbance where they'd taken their midday rest. One warrior dismounted, examining the ground. Xavier knew their chances if discovered, slim to none. He might take down 2 before they overwhelmed him, and then Zarina and the children would face a fate worse than quick death. The warrior called out to his companions, pointing toward the rocks where they hid. Xavier raised his rifle, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Beside him, he felt Zarina shift. "Wait," she whispered, so softly he barely heard. She placed a hand on his arm, then leaned close to his ear. "Let me try something first." Before he could stop her, she began to sing, a haunting, wordless melody that carried clearly across the rocks. Xavier stared at her in disbelief, certain she'd doomed them all. The warriors outside grew silent, listening. Zarina continued singing, her voice unwavering as she slowly stood, still hidden from direct view. The song changed, incorporating words in Apache that Xavier couldn't understand. It had the cadence of a prayer or ceremonial chant. The warriors conferred among themselves, clearly unsettled. After what seemed an eternity, they remounted and continued on their way, giving the rocks a wide berth. Xavier waited until they were well out of sight before turning to Zarina. "What did you do?" "Death song," she explained, her voice now shaking slightly with the aftermath of fear. "They believe a spirit dwells here, singing of death. To disturb such a spirit would bring misfortune." "That was the most reckless," Xavier began, then stopped himself, reconsidering. "And the bravest thing I've seen." For the first time, Zarina smiled, a small but genuine expression that transformed her face. "Sometimes courage and recklessness look the same, Mr. Vance." They made camp that evening in a sheltered canyon, having pushed hard to put distance between themselves and the renegade band. Xavier built a small, nearly smokeless fire while Zarina prepared a simple meal from their provisions. Tamaz had gradually warmed to Xavier throughout the afternoon, especially after Xavier had lifted him onto Chief's back and let him hold the reins for a short while. Now the boy sat cross-legged near the fire, solemnly feeding small twigs into the flames under Xavier's watchful eye. "He likes you," Zarina observed as she rocked the baby to sleep. Xavier shrugged uncomfortably. "Kids are easy to impress." "Not Tamaz," she countered. "He has not taken to anyone since his father died." She hesitated, then added, "You remind me of him, Tamaz's father. He was a quiet man, too." "Strong." Xavier found himself unexpectedly curious. What happened to him? Zarina's expression clouded. "He was killed when the soldiers came to force us to the reservation. He was not even fighting, just trying to protect my sister." She stroked the sleeping baby's head. "Luisa never knew her father." The simple tragedy of it struck Xavier more deeply than he expected. He thought of his own parents, of the home he'd lost. The boy was watching him, those solemn eyes reflecting the firelight. "I lost my family too," Xavier found himself saying. "Raiders hit our homestead 4 years ago. I was out hunting. Came back to nothing." Zarina nodded, understanding in her eyes. "So you wander, thinking attachment brings only pain." "Doesn't it?" The question came out more vulnerable than he'd intended. "Pain is part of life," she said simply. "To avoid attachment is to avoid living." Xavier had no answer to that. They ate in companionable silence, the night deepening around them. When it came time to sleep, Xavier insisted on taking first watch, positioning himself on a rock outcropping with clear views of their surroundings. From his perch he watched Zarina settle the children on a bedroll, singing softly to them until they slept. There was something about her, a quiet strength, a dignity despite circumstances that would break many. Her proposition still seemed impossible, yet he found himself considering what life might be like with a partner like her, someone who understood loss but hadn't surrendered to it. The night passed uneventfully, and they continued their journey at dawn. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they approached the mountains they needed to cross before reaching Tucson. By mid-morning, dark clouds had gathered, threatening a rare summer storm. "There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead," Xavier said, eyeing the darkening sky with concern, "used by cattle outfits during roundup. We should reach it before the worst hits." They pushed on as the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly becoming a downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. Thunder crashed overhead, spooking the horses. Xavier led them forward carefully, relieved when the weathered outline of the shack finally emerged through the curtain of rain. It was a crude structure, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but solid enough to provide shelter. Inside was dusty but dry, with a small fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a couple of crude bunks built into one wall. "It's not much," Xavier apologized as they hurried inside, soaked to the skin. "It is a palace compared to some places I have sheltered," Zarina replied, immediately setting to work. She laid out their bedrolls to dry while Xavier got a fire going in the small stone fireplace. The storm intensified, wind howling around the cabin's corners as rain pounded the roof. Tamaz whimpered, frightened by the thunder, until Xavier distracted him by carving a small horse from a piece of firewood. The boy watched, fascinated, as the shape emerged from the wood. "You have skilled hands," Zarina observed, feeding Luisa by the warmth of the fire. Xavier shrugged. "My father taught me. Said a man should be able to make something from nothing." He handed the finished carving to Tamaz, whose face lit with wonder. "A wise man," Zarina said, "like his son." Xavier looked up, caught by the warmth in her voice. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine this as more than a temporary arrangement, a family gathered around a fire, finding comfort in each other against the world's storms. The thought both terrified and tempted him. "We should reach Tucson in 2 days," he said, changing the subject. "Your relatives, they'll take all 3 of you in." Something flickered in Zarina's eyes. "They have agreed to take us, yes. My mother's cousin has a small ranch outside town." But, she hesitated, "it would not be a life of dignity. Their charity comes with conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "The children would be raised as Mexican, not Apache. I would work as a servant, not family." Her voice was steady, but Xavier heard the pain beneath. "It is still better than the reservation, where sickness takes so many children." Xavier frowned. "That's no kind of life." "It is survival," she replied simply. "Sometimes that must be enough." The storm continued through the afternoon and into the evening, forcing them to remain in the cabin. Xavier found himself relaxing as the hours passed, drawn into conversation with Zarina as the children played or slept. She told him of her childhood, divided between the Apache world of her mother and the trading post where her father had worked. She spoke of the missionaries who had taught her English and Spanish, of the books she had read secretly by candlelight. In turn, Xavier found himself sharing stories of his own upbringing on a small ranch in Texas, of his father's dreams to expand their holdings, of his mother's garden that had produced the sweetest tomatoes in the county. He spoke of things he hadn't allowed himself to remember in years, surprised by how the memories now brought as much warmth as pain. Night fell, and after a simple supper, they settled the children to sleep on one of the bunks. The storm had abated to a gentle rain, drumming softly on the roof. Xavier added wood to the fire, watching the flames dance. "You never answered my question," he said finally, looking across the fire at Zarina. "Why me?" "There must be men on the reservation who would take you as wife." "None I would trust with these children," she answered, "and none who could move freely in both worlds as I must." She met his gaze directly. "You asked why I watched you. I saw a man who walks alone by choice, not necessity, a man respected by both soldiers and Apache at the agency, a man who keeps his word." That's not much to base a life on. It is more than many marriages begin with, she countered. My own parents met only twice before their wedding day. They grew to love each other deeply. Xavier stared into the fire, conflicted. The proposition that had seemed so outlandish yesterday now pulled at something deep within him. I've been alone a long time, he said finally. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. Neither do I, Zarina admitted softly. Perhaps we could learn together. The simple honesty of her words moved him. He looked up to find her watching him, her expression open and unguarded. For the first time in years, Xavier allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the next town, the next job, a future with connections that anchored rather than constrained. I make no promises, he said carefully, but when we reach Tucson, we could talk more about this arrangement. Zarina's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, warm, transforming. That is all I ask. A chance. Morning brought clear skies and muddy trails. They set out early, making slower progress than Xavier had hoped due to the treacherous footing. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the pass that would take them through the mountains and into the valley where Tucson lay. We'll camp at the summit tonight, Xavier decided, studying the steep trail ahead. It's too dangerous to attempt the descent in fading light. They made their way carefully upward, the horses straining against the incline. Near the top, the trail narrowed dangerously, hugging the mountainside with a sheer drop to their right. Xavier dismounted and led Chief by the reins, motioning for Zarina to do the same with her mount. Stay close to the wall, he instructed, helping her down. I'll lead the horses one by one. He took Chief first, then returned for Zarina's horse and the pack animal. As he was leading the second horse across the narrowest section, a rattlesnake struck from a crevice in the rocks. The horse reared in panic, nearly sending Xavier over the edge. He managed to maintain his grip on the reins, but as the horse came down, its hoof landed on the crumbling edge of the trail. Time seemed to slow as Xavier watched the ground give way beneath the terrified animal. The horse scrambled frantically, front hooves still on solid ground while its hindquarters slipped over the edge. Their supplies began to slide from the panicked animal's back. Xavier! Zarina's scream pierced the air. Acting on instinct, Xavier pulled his knife and slashed the ropes securing their supplies, sacrificing them to lighten the horse's burden. With a final desperate heave, he pulled the animal forward onto stable ground where it stood trembling. Are you hurt? Zarina rushed to his side, Louisa clutched to her chest and Tamaz clinging to her skirt. Xavier shook his head, breathing hard. Just supplies lost. He peered over the edge at their provisions scattered across the rocks below. Most of our food, all the coffee, half our ammunition. But we are alive, Zarina said firmly. The rest we can manage without. They continued to the summit with extreme caution, reaching a small plateau just as the sun began to set. Xavier built a fire while Zarina took stock of what supplies remained in the bags they carried on their persons. We have jerky, a little cornmeal, and some dried fruit, she reported. Enough for tomorrow, but we will need to hunt or forage after that. Tucson's 2 days away. If we push hard, Xavier calculated, we can make it. They ate sparingly that night, saving what they could for the journey ahead. Despite the setback, Xavier found himself strangely at peace as they sat by the fire. Tamaz had fallen asleep against his side, the wooden horse still clutched in his small hand. He trusts you completely now, Zarina observed, smiling at the sight. Xavier looked down at the boy, a protective instinct rising in his chest that both surprised and frightened him. Kids shouldn't trust so easily out here. It's dangerous. Trust is always a risk, she agreed, but without it, what is life? Her words stayed with Xavier as he took the first watch that night. From their elevated position, he could see for miles in every direction. The vast landscape spread below him, bathed in moonlight, beautiful and deadly, like so much of the frontier. He had spent years convincing himself that solitude was safer, that attachments only gave a man more to lose. Yet sitting here with Zarina and the children sleeping peacefully nearby, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The next day brought new challenges. The descent was treacherous, requiring them to lead the horses on foot for most of the morning. By afternoon, they had reached the valley floor, but the loss of their water reserves meant they needed to find a water source before continuing. Xavier remembered a small creek that should be flowing despite the summer heat. He led them several miles off their direct route to find it, relieved when the sound of running water finally reached their ears. As Zarina filled their canteens, Xavier noticed Tamaz watching something in the distance. Following the boy's gaze, he spotted movement among the cottonwoods lining the creek, a small herd of pronghorn antelope. "Wait here," he whispered to Zarina. "Fresh meat would serve us better than this jerky." Taking his rifle, Xavier crept through the brush, using every stalking skill he possessed. The wind was in his favor, carrying his scent away from the herd. When he was within range, he took careful aim at a young buck at the edge of the group. The shot echoed across the valley. The buck dropped instantly, the rest of the herd bounding away in panic. Xavier hurried forward, knife ready to dress the kill. By the time he dragged the dressed antelope back to their camp, Zarina had a small fire going. Her eyes widened at the sight of the meat. "That will feed us well," she said appreciatively. They worked together to cut strips for immediate cooking and to smoke the rest for the journey. As dusk approached, they feasted on the fresh meat, all of them eating their fill for the first time in days. "You are a skilled hunter," Zarina commented as she fed Luisa small pieces of tender meat. "These children would never go hungry with you as their father." The comment hung in the air between them, neither casual observation nor direct question, but somewhere in between. Xavier found himself considering it seriously rather than deflecting as he might have days earlier. "A good provider needs more than hunting skills," he said finally, "needs land, a home. Stability. Do you not wish for those things?" Zarina asked. Xavier stared into the fire. "I did once before." He didn't need to specify before what they both understood loss. Afterward it seemed. Tempting fate to want them again. "So you punish yourself by wanting nothing." The directness of her question startled him. "It's not punishment, it's protection." "From what life?" Zarina shook her head. "The raiders took your family, Xavier. Why let them take your future too?" Her words struck him like a physical blow. He had never framed his wandering existence that way, as a continued victory for those who had destroyed his home. The thought was unsettling. "What would you have instead?" she continued softly. "To die alone, having touched no lives, leaving nothing behind, is that victory?" Xavier had no answer. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence, the question lingering between them as they prepared for another night under the stars. Morning brought with it a sense of impending conclusion. One more day's travel would bring them to Tucson, where decisions could no longer be postponed. They broke camp efficiently, now working together with the ease of an established routine. As they rode, Xavier found himself studying Zarina more openly than before, the graceful way she handled her horse even with Luisa secured to her back, the patience she showed with Tamaz's endless questions. The quiet strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardship. She was unlike any woman he had known, neither seeking his protection through weakness nor rejecting it through pride. Instead, she offered partnership, mutual strength, mutual support. They stopped briefly at midday, sharing the last of the smoked antelope. As they prepared to continue, Xavier noticed a dust cloud on the horizon behind them. "Riders," he said tersely, "moving fast." Zarina's expression tightened as she secured Luisa and helped Tamaz onto her horse. "Raiders." Could be Army patrol." Xavier squinted against the sun. "Either way, we're better moving than waiting to find out." They rode hard through the afternoon, but it soon became clear the riders were gaining on them. Xavier led them toward a rocky outcropping that would provide some defense if it came to a fight. "Get behind those rocks," he instructed Zarina as they dismounted. "Take the children, I'll deal with whoever's coming." "No," she said firmly, surprising him. "We face them together." Before he could argue, the riders came into clear view, 6 men, rough-looking, definitely not military. Xavier recognized their type immediately, bounty hunters or bandits, the kind who preyed on travelers in the borderlands. "Get down," he hissed, pulling Zarina and Tamaz behind a large boulder as the riders approached. The men circled their position, clearly aware of their presence. One called out, "We know you're there, come out peaceful-like." Xavier exchanged a glance with Zarina, whose face had gone very still. 7 cartridges, he whispered, checking his rifle, not enough for all of them. I recognize 2 of them, she whispered back. They worked for the Indian agent at San Carlos. Corrupt men who sold agency supplies on the black market. A cold certainty settled in Xavier's gut. They're after you, probably bounty hunters hired to bring you back to the reservation. Zarina's eyes flashed with determination. I will not go back, those children will not grow up there. No, Xavier agreed, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. They won't. The leader of the bounty hunters called again. Woman, we know you're the Valencia half-breed. We're authorized to take you back to San Carlos. Come peaceful and nobody gets hurt. Xavier's mind raced. Direct confrontation would be suicide, but perhaps there was another way. He turned to Zarina. Can you ride at night? Find your way to Tucson from here. She nodded without hesitation. Yes, the stars will guide me. Good. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the papers the colonel had given him, her official permission to leave the reservation. Take these. When I give the signal, get to the horses, ride east into those hills, then double back south after dark. Don't stop until you reach Tucson. What signal? She asked. What are you going to do? Xavier checked his rifle one more time, his decision made, creating a distraction. The clarity of purpose felt strangely liberating. For the first time in years he had someone worth risking everything for. I'm coming out, he shouted to the bounty hunters. Just me, I want to talk. Xavier, no, Zarina began, but he silenced her with a look. Trust me, he said softly, get ready to run when I start shooting. Before she could protest further, he stepped out from behind the rocks, rifle held loosely in one hand, the other raised to show he wasn't immediately hostile. Gentlemen, he called, seems we have a misunderstanding. The bounty hunters spread out, weapons trained on him. Their leader, a scarred man with a tobacco-stained beard, spat into the dust. No misunderstanding, where's the woman? Gone, Xavier lied smoothly. Sent her ahead this morning with an army patrol. She's probably in Tucson by now with her legal papers filed. The leader's eyes narrowed. You're lying. Xavier shrugged, moving casually to position himself where he could see all 6 men and, more importantly, draw their attention away from the rocks where Zarina waited. Check for yourself. Or better yet, I've got a copy of her papers right here. He reached slowly into his jacket, watching as all 6 men tensed. Instead of papers, he drew his revolver with lightning speed, firing at the closest man while diving for cover. Now, he shouted to Zarina as chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded around him as he rolled behind a boulder, coming up firing. He took down a second man before bullets began chipping away at his cover. From the corner of his eye, he saw Zarina running low to the ground, Luisa strapped to her back and Tamaz clutched in her arms. She reached the horses, managing to mount despite her burden. Xavier provided covering fire as she spurred her horse eastward, disappearing into a cloud of dust with the pack horse following on a lead rope. 2 of the bounty hunters turned to pursue, but Xavier's well-placed shots forced them back to cover. Now the odds were 4-1, and Xavier had used most of his ammunition. He needed to create enough confusion to make his own escape and lead these men away from Zarina's trail. He waited until the firing paused, then made a break for Chief, who was stamping nervously nearby. Bullets kicked up dust at his heels as he ran, one grazing his arm with a burning slash. He grabbed Chief's reins, swung into the saddle, and galloped north, directly away from Zarina's escape route. The bounty hunters followed, just as he'd hoped. Chief was faster than their mounts, but Xavier kept him at a pace that would encourage pursuit rather than discourage it. Mile after mile, he led them deeper into rough country where tracking would become increasingly difficult. As dusk approached, he finally lost sight of his pursuers. Finding a hidden ravine, he dismounted, tending to his wounded arm and giving Chief a much-needed rest. The bullet had only grazed him, leaving a painful but not serious wound that he bandaged with a strip of cloth from his shirt. His thoughts turned to Zarina and the children. Had they made it safely away, would they find their way to Tucson? And what awaited them there? The life of servitude she had described, or something better? The question that troubled him most was his own role in their future. For days, he had avoided committing to Zarina's proposition, hiding behind his belief that attachments only led to pain. Yet when danger threatened, he had acted without hesitation to protect her and the children, not as a paid escort but as a man defending his family. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. Somewhere along their journey, these people had become more than traveling companions. They had become the very attachments he had sworn to avoid, and instead of making him vulnerable, they had given him purpose. With the night deepening around him, Xavier made his decision. As soon as he was certain the bounty hunters were truly thrown off the trail, he would make his way to Tucson. Not to deliver Zarina to her relatives and collect his payment, but to offer her a different future, one they would build together. 2 days later, dusty and exhausted, Xavier rode into Tucson. The town bustled with the usual frontier activity: wagons loading at mercantile stores, cowboys lounging outside saloons, ladies with parasols navigating the wooden sidewalks. He rode directly to the sheriff's office, needing information before anything else. Sheriff Dahlen was a grizzled veteran of both the Civil War and the Apache conflicts, known for his fairness if not his pleasant disposition. He looked up from his desk as Xavier entered, eyes narrowing in recognition. "Vance, isn't it? Thought you were still scouting up at Fort Apache." "Was," Xavier confirmed. "Sheriff, I'm looking for a woman who should have arrived in town yesterday or early today." "Apache woman with 2 small children." The sheriff's expression gave nothing away. "Got a name for this woman." "Zarina Valencia. She has legal papers allowing her to leave the reservation." Sheriff Dahlen leaned back in his chair, studying Xavier carefully. "And what's your interest in her?" Xavier met his gaze directly. "I escorted her from Fort Apache. We were separated when bounty hunters attacked. I need to know she made it safely." "Bounty hunters," the sheriff sat forward. "Working for who?" "Don't know, probably hired by someone at San Carlos who didn't want her leaving." Xavier's patience was wearing thin. "Have you seen her or not?" Dahlen rose slowly. "As a matter of fact, I have. She arrived yesterday afternoon, papers in order, said she was attacked on the trail but managed to escape." He paused. "She also said her escort was killed protecting her." Relief flooded Xavier, followed by surprise. "She thinks I'm dead." Apparently, the sheriff studied him with renewed interest. "She's staying at the widow Martinez's boarding house on the edge of town, mentioned relatives coming for her today." Xavier was already moving toward the door. "Which way to the Martinez place?" "North end past the church," Dahlen called after him. "Vance, those bounty hunters, they break any laws in my jurisdiction. I want to know about it." Xavier barely heard him, already mounting chief and turning north. The Martinez boarding house proved to be a modest adobe structure with a small garden out front. Xavier dismounted, suddenly uncertain. What if Zarina had already left with her relatives? What if she didn't welcome his arrival? Before he could knock, the door opened to reveal a stern-looking Mexican woman in her 60s. "Yes, what do you want?" "I'm looking for Zarina Valencia," Xavier said, removing his hat. "Is she here?" The woman's expression grew suspicious. "Who is asking?" "Xavier Vance, I'm a friend." The woman studied him for a long moment, then turned and called something in Spanish into the house. A moment later, Zarina appeared in the doorway, Luisa on her hip. She froze at the sight of him, her face draining of color. "Xavier," she whispered, "they said you were killed." "Takes more than a few bounty hunters to finish me," he said, attempting a smile that faded as he took in her appearance. She wore a plain brown dress that wasn't her own, and her hair was styled in a Mexican fashion rather than her usual braid. "You're alive," she said, still staring as if at a ghost. Then she stepped forward, touching his arm as if to confirm his solidity. "You're alive." The next moment she was in his arms, Luisa squished between them. Xavier held her tightly, inhaling the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her against him. Something tight and cold inside him unraveled at her touch. "I thought I lost you," she murmured against his chest. "I thought." "I'm here," he said simply, the words carrying more meaning than he could express. Tomás appeared in the doorway, his solemn eyes widening at the sight of Xavier. Without hesitation, the boy ran to him, wrapping his arms around Xavier's legs. The widow Martinez cleared her throat pointedly. Perhaps this reunion should continue inside, away from prying eyes. Inside the small parlor, Xavier learned that Zarina's relatives, second cousins she had never actually met, had indeed come that morning. They had offered to take her and the children as planned, but with conditions even more restrictive than she had initially described. They said Tamaz must be sent to a mission school, Zarina explained bitterly. That Luisa and I could live in their back room and help with the washing, that we must never speak Apache or acknowledge our heritage. She shook her head. I refused. Good, Xavier said firmly. That's no life for any of you. But what choice do I have? Her voice held a weariness that pained him. We cannot return to San Carlos. I have no money, no prospects. Xavier took a deep breath, the decision he had made during his solitary ride to Tucson crystallizing into certainty. You have me, he said simply, if you still want me. Zarina stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. What are you saying? I'm saying yes to your proposition. He took her hands in his. I'll be a father to these children, a husband to you, if you'll have me. You said the frontier was no place for family, she reminded him softly. I was wrong. Xavier's voice grew stronger with conviction. The frontier is exactly where family matters most. Where else do you need someone watching your back, standing beside you against whatever comes? He squeezed her hands. I've been running from attachments, thinking they made me vulnerable. But these past days showed me the truth. Being alone is what makes us weak. Tears filled Zarina's eyes. You truly mean this, not from pity or obligation. Not from pity, he assured her, from choice. My choice, he glanced at Tamaz, who was watching them intently, and at Luisa, who had fallen asleep on her mother's lap. I want this, I want you, all of you. Zarina's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face. Then yes, she said simply, my answer is yes. They were married 3 days later by the town's justice of the peace, with the widow Martinez and Sheriff Dolan as witnesses. Xavier had used some of his army pay to purchase a simple gold band for Zarina and new clothes for all of them. Tamaz stood solemnly beside them during the ceremony, holding the rings on a small cushion with grave importance. After the wedding, Xavier revealed the other preparation he had made. Using his savings and the promised bonus from the colonel, he had put a down payment on a small ranch 20 miles outside of Tucson, 200 acres with a modest cabin, a good well, and grazing rights to adjacent land. It needs work, he warned as they approached the property the following day. The previous owner let things go, but the land is good and there's room to grow. Zarina took in the weathered cabin, the overgrown garden, the sagging corral fence. Instead of disappointment, her face showed only determination and possibility. It is a beginning, she said, squeezing his hand, our beginning. As they stood together in the doorway of what would become their home, Tamaz exploring the yard with delighted curiosity and Luisa babbling happily in Zarina's arms, Xavier felt the last of his defensive walls crumble. The painful past would always be part of him, but it no longer defined his future. Welcome home, he said, drawing Zarina close. Her smile contained all the promise of their shared future. Home, she agreed. At last. In the years that followed, the Vance ranch prospered. Xavier's skill with horses allowed him to establish a successful breeding operation, while Zarina's garden became known throughout the county for its abundance. Tamaz grew into a strong young man who combined his Apache heritage with his adopted father's ranching knowledge. Luisa blossomed into a bright, curious girl with her mother's dignity and her father's determined spirit. And when visitors to the ranch remarked on the unlikely partnership that had created such a thriving homestead, Xavier would simply smile and say that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from finding the courage to join your life with another's. For on the frontier where danger and hardship were constant companions, love wasn't a luxury, it was survival. And in choosing to build a family in this harsh land, Xavier and Zarina had discovered a truth that transformed their wounded past into a future full of promise. That in the vast wilderness of the American West, the most valuable territory wasn't land or gold, but the home they had created together.